You should just be able to get a bunch of sick people and a group of healthy people, and you put them in a room together and you see what happens. Like, that's as difficult as it needs to be. And you can see, did the healthy people become sick? Most people, if you ask them on the street what would happen, they'd say, of course. If it was chickenpox or measles or the flu, yes, the healthy people would get this illness. There might be a few people that don't, but that's because they've got strong immune systems, but the majority would. Now, these experiments have been done. Most people don't realize that they've been done. And what happened was that basically nobody got sick. And if people did get sick, there are other potential explanations as to why they got ill. So there was just a number, like a very small handful of people in any of these experiments who got symptoms that were said to be, proof of disease transmission. But when you really sink your teeth into it and you pull back the layers, it becomes apparent that they have never demonstrated this phenomena called contagion.
This is Spirit Gym. Paul's guest today is Daniel Roytas, the author of Can You Catch a Cold? Untold History and Human Experiments. Thank you for listening to this podcast, which would not be possible without you, our subscribers, and also our premier sponsors, Organifi, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, and Wild Pastures. The sponsors' special offers and discounts are mentioned throughout this episode, or you can visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast. Today's episode with Paul and Daniel is called Are You Being Experimented On?
Welcome. Today, my guest is Daniel Roytas. There are many others that share similar views that Daniel shares in his book. I've interviewed a number of them, including Andrew Kaufman, Tom Cowan, MD, who is now retired. Another book I was just sharing with Daniel reminded me of his book is Don Lester and David Parker's very comprehensive book, which I recommend to all of you, as well as Daniel's book, called What Really Makes You Ill? Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong. I've also had multiple conversations with Nathan Riley, MD, host of the Holistic OBGYN podcast on these issues, who's our family OBGYN, one of the best doctors I've ever met in my entire life, as well as Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, who's an expert on vaccinations, all that feel the germ theory is dangerously incorrect and inaccurate. So Daniel, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today. It's an honor.
Thank you. I must thank my Chek instructor, Lee Brandon, who really enjoyed his podcast with you. Highly recommended I get a hold of you and your book and have you on the show. And I'm really grateful that he recommended that. I think your book's extremely important. And I must give you a honor of valor and honesty and commitment to humanity for publishing the truth. It's very, very rare. And if it was 2 years ago or more and you tried to publish that book, many publishers probably wouldn't have published it. So I'm glad you got it out there.
Yeah, it was actually self-published because I don't think that anyone would touch
Good
it.
idea.
But funnily enough, since I self-published, I've had a number of publishing houses overseas pick the book up and translate it. So it's currently being translated into Dutch and Japanese. There's a person in China who's translating it, and it may be translated into Spanish soon. So it's been nice to see that support coming from overseas.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm grateful for that. It's interesting you mentioned Dutch because my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, is translated into Dutch, and it's also translated into Swedish. Those were the first two countries, different people in each of the different countries that wanted to publish it because they felt it was important to do. So it's always great when you get your book into the language of people in different cultures so they can absorb it more directly. So I'm super excited to hear that your book, I hope it gets to every language, to be honest with you. I think it's that important.
Thanks, Paul.
Daniel, from reading the foreword of your book, Can You Catch a Cold? The Untold Story of Human Experiments, it's evident that you're not just an investigative journalist. You have a tremendous amount of experience in both naturopathic medicine, nutrition, and the relevant sciences. So to begin our interview dialogue today, I would love it if you can give an overview of your career and what led you to researching what is ultimately the germ versus terrain theories of how infections and illnesses are transmitted and influence human beings. Just because I like people to get a sense of who you are, where you come from, it'll make it easier for them to digest what you're about to share and what you share in your book.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, this is what I think is the most important issue of modern times. Certainly the most important issue in my lifetime, and maybe we will see it all unravel at some point. My background is, as you said, in naturopathic medicine. I actually heard about this idea that germs may not cause illness in my undergraduate degree, which was in naturopathy, and didn't hear much more of it. I sort of dismissed it at that time throughout my career. So I spent over 10 years as a clinician. When I graduated, I went on to do some postgraduate qualifications and became a lecturer of nutritional medicine and naturopathic medicine at a number of colleges and a university in Australia. And I worked my way up the ranks from a tutor to a senior lecturer. I held that position for a number of years, but recently resigned in 2022 because I just couldn't bring myself to continue teaching a curriculum that I didn't believe in. Over 10 years as a clinician, over 10 years as a lecturer and senior lecturer. When I originally heard about germ theory and terrain theory and this idea that germs may not be the cause of disease back in 2006, I dismissed it because I thought, no, germ theory's been proven, been scientifically demonstrated that germs cause illness, and natural medicine's got it wrong. Naturopathy's got it wrong. The people who used to believe this were living in the dark ages. This is an archaic way of thinking. And I dismissed that. So I approached a way that I practiced for a decade under the understanding, or from the guise of, there are germs, but they can only make you sick if your immune system or your terrain isn't healthy enough. So you still have to be mindful of germs. And if they're there, but you're doing all the right things, you're exercising, eating well, getting good restful sleep, etc., your body will be strong enough to ward them off. So it's not really that much of a problem. But then in early 2020, I heard a couple of doctors, so Dr. Andrew Kaufman, who's been a great supporter of mine. I thank him very much, as has people like Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Sam Bailey, Dr. Kelly Brogan. I heard these doctors sort of talking about this idea that germs don't cause illness. I thought, this is really strange because I've heard this before. And given my position as a senior lecturer, I was sort of talking all around the country, presenting not only at the university I was working at, but also for a range of product companies and associations and various other groups doing public speaking. I knew that this question would come up because we're in the middle of a pandemic. It was a hot topic, and I thought, well, I have to go and investigate it and become really clear in my own mind about what's going on, because when the question comes up, I want to be able to answer it truthfully and honestly. So I started looking for evidence to demonstrate that sick people make healthy people sick. That was the beginning of the book, Can You Catch a Cold? So over a very short period of time, I accrued a repository of hundreds of experiments where this very process had been undertaken by researchers and doctors since the early 1900s. And what I found really shocked me. They weren't able to demonstrate this phenomenon that we all believe to be true. And that was sort of, the beginning of the end. From that point on, I realized that our understanding needed a course correction, that in fact what I had been told all those years earlier was correct, and I'd been practicing under a false paradigm. And it was incredibly freeing, but also incredibly a challenging time for me, because I knew that this would mean I could no longer continue down my current course of work as a career academic and working my way up through the sort of ladder in the educational institution there, and that I would need to make a drastic change in my life, because you certainly can't be talking about these kinds of things and be supported by any mainstream educational institution. So it's been an interesting journey, but I certainly don't regret any of it.
What are you doing now? Are you focusing on your book publishing, or are you seeing patients, or how have you transitioned?
My attention now has really been focusing on getting the word out about not just my book, but helping people to understand health and disease and what it really is, just to clear away some of the cobwebs and help course correct our understanding. I'm not saying we have to throw everything out. We just need to sort of course correct the current knowledge and understanding that we have. So I educate through my website, humanly.com, humanley.com. And I'm also doing podcasts and presentations and things, not just about can you catch a cold, but health and wellness and how we can make the world a better place, looking at things like regenerative agriculture, how to become more sustainable, how to live in harmony with nature, all of these things that are very important. So not seeing patients at the moment. I've sort of taken a break from that because I think the information that I share can be applied very widely. And if I'm just educating one person at a time in clinic, it's going to be a very long and arduous and tedious process
Yes.
to change our understanding and what people can do to better their health. So I'm trying to do that on a broader scale by sharing information on podcasts like yours.
I think it's important, and what you've come to is what I've been teaching my whole career. I think you know that, but I put my Spirit Gym program together, and I'm about to publish the first of 15 volumes of Spirit Gym. So I had to stop seeing patients because I just couldn't juggle seeing patients and doing that much writing and development without just killing myself. And I exactly the same. I just felt like, I can't really, with my experience and knowledge, focus on one person at a time, because this is a global issue, and we need everybody who has a depth of knowledge and enough clinical experience to have some credibility to put a full court press on this thing before we're all swept into a nightmare bigger than COVID. Because as you know, COVID was only the tip of a sword that's got a lot more edge. And if we aren't careful, they'll use it. So I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. So thank you very much for that. Now, we've kind of made it pretty obvious here as to why the book and the conversation is important, particularly after what the world went through with COVID. Is there more you would like to add in that regard?
Well, this idea that I can be doing everything right in my life, health wise, so I'm looking after myself mentally, physically, spiritually, I'm eating well, I'm filtering my water, I'm exercising, I'm meditating, I'm abstaining from alcohol and cigarettes, and doing all of these things that we associate with health. I can be doing all of these things, putting the time and effort in, and be one day walking down the street minding my own business, and then walk past Joe Bloggs on the street who's not doing any of those things, who is now at risk of harboring, or who is harboring, an infectious, contagious pathogen, and then he can pass that on to me and undo all of the hard work that I've done and now cause illness in me. That phenomena is something that we have been brought up with since basically the day we could walk or talk. Our parents or people in places of authority tell us that this is so, and we believe it. And then we frame the way that we approach life and our very existence under this guise, or from this point of reference, that illness is transmitted, and we live our lives accordingly. Now, that should be a very simple thing in principle to demonstrate, Paul, that sick people make healthy people sick. And these experiments, you should just be able to get a bunch of sick people and a group of healthy people, and you put them in a room together and you see what happens. Like, that's as difficult as it needs to be. And you can see, did the healthy people become sick? Most people, if you ask them on the street what would happen, they'd say, of course. If it was chickenpox or measles or the flu, yes, the healthy people would get this illness. There might be a few people that don't, but that's because they've got strong immune systems, but the majority would. Now, these experiments have been done. Most people don't realize that they've been done. And what happened was that basically nobody got sick. And if people did get sick, there are other potential explanations as to why they got ill. So there was just a number, like a very small handful of people in any of these experiments who got symptoms that were said to be, proof of disease transmission. But when you really sink your teeth into it and you pull back the layers, it becomes apparent that they have never demonstrated this phenomena called contagion. And that may come to a shock to some people, because our lives, not just over the last 4 years, but for many decades now, even over a century, have been dictated by this idea. Now, if that idea is wrong, that's a major problem. It has societal, political, religious, scientific explanations. The consequences are far-reaching. So it's a very wide impact that it would have if that is proven to be false. So I think it's important that we look at this idea with an open mind. We're critical about the evidence that's there, and we're able to have these discussions free from being ridiculed or being called names. It's like, let's just look at what the science says. What are the facts? And let's toss out anything that's not supported by evidence or that is pseudoscience, and let's start again from fresh so that we can get humanity on the right track and move together with an understanding that is based in reality, that is based in fact.
Yeah, there's another factor too. I mean, there's a lot of factors, but one important one that I want to put on the table here, because I'm sure you'll have something to say about it, and that is the power of belief. And we know from countless studies on the placebo effect, which, as you know, in reverse is the nocebo effect, which has been shown to be just as valid and just as effective. When you get enough people believing something like that, they can actually create the symptoms of an illness or even a disease, and even manifest diseases. I've actually seen clinical cases in books I have right in my library where physicians misdiagnosed people with, say, cancer or a tumor, and later found out that they were actually looking at the wrong scans, but the person manifested that disease, oftentimes within as little time as a few days. You know, when you look at this from kind of the Rockefeller perspective, if you can brainwash enough people into an idea that sells trillions of dollars worth of drugs and surgeries, then it's a very, very good business model. Even when you take a bunch of people and do a scientific study and put healthy people with sick people and say, okay, let me see how many of these people that are healthy get sick from these sick people. Even the healthy people, if they come into the study and they've already got that belief, they actually can skew the study, because we are not able to, without careful testing, differentiate whether their symptoms are actually disease symptoms or the manifestation of the influence of the mind on the body, which produces the same symptoms.
It's a huge factor. A huge factor. And I think that much of what we've seen over the last 4 years has been down to expectation and belief and the nocebo effect, as you pointed out. Now, if we believe something to be true with the very fiber, every fiber of our being, is it possible that we can make it true? So,
Yep.
for example, as children, our parents, teachers, doctors, the government, people in positions of power and authority that we trust wholeheartedly and we respect, tell us that things like colds and flus are contagious. That when you come in contact with little Johnny who's got a sniffle, he'll give you his sniffle. You'll catch his cold. And inevitably, one day you come in contact with a sick person and then you get the same symptoms and you confirm that belief. Ah, yes, well, disease is transmissible. So you go through for the rest of your life believing that you can catch someone's cold. So the next time someone else is around you who's sniffing and coughing and whatever else, you become ill and you go, see, yeah, it is. It's moving between people. But there are other explanations as to why that may happen. Now, placebo, nocebo expectation is one. There's various other reasons why that may happen, like common environmental exposure. We can certainly get into that. But it may be difficult for people to accept that this can actually happen. You're telling me that I can create symptoms of a cold or flu just with my mind alone because I erroneously believe that it's true? And the answer to that question is yes. And it's been demonstrated in experiments. Now, I found
Lots
experiments
of them.
in one of the experiments in the book where they wanted to investigate whether or not this was actually possible. So they said to somebody, when I say they, doctors and scientists, said to somebody, okay, Mr. Jones, we're going to expose you to some flu germs now. So they took this little canister, they came along and sprayed it in the back of his throat, and they sprayed it in his nose, and I think they dropped some stuff into his eyes and whatever else. They said, all right, Mr. Jones, we've given you the flu germs, and now we want to see what happens. So they put him in an observation room, and they watched him over the course of several hours. And during that time, he started developing symptoms of a full-blown cold. He was sniffing and coughing and bringing up sputum, and he got a fever, and he was up all night moaning and groaning. And the next morning, the nurse came in and said, Mr. Smith, or Mr. Jones, we got you, April Fools. We didn't expose you to flu germs. We exposed you to salt water. And within 15 minutes, he was better. All his symptoms resolved. So he manifested the cold with the power of his mind. There was no germs that he was exposed to. That's really important because many of these experiments where people did get sick was done at places or institutions like the Common Cold Research Unit, where people volunteered to go there to be experimented on. Now, they expected there was a 50-50 chance that when I'm exposed to someone or I have something sprayed into my face, it's going to be flu germs. So even though in some of these experiments, they didn't know whether or not they were being exposed to a placebo or actual flu germs. They had the expectation, a 50-50 expectation, that they very possibly could. Now, that alone may be enough for people to induce a cold or a flu. And in fact, in many experiments where people have been exposed to salt water, they develop colds and flus. In some experiments, there were greater percentages of people falling ill with colds or flu when they were exposed to salt water than in the groups of people who were supposedly exposed to flu germs. So we can't say that
That's interesting.
being exposed to someone's mucus who's sick transfers a invisible microscopic particle to you which infects you and makes you ill, because the exact same thing happens when people are exposed to salt water. So that demonstrates conclusively that salt water is enough, or the power of the mind is enough to do this. Now, if you extrapolate that phenomena, the second last thing I want to say is that none of these experiments were actually properly controlled. They didn't control for the power of belief or expectation. So really what they should have done in some of these experiments was expose people to the infected mucus of sick people, but tell them, hey, we're giving you a health-providing substance. Or you start up a clinic called the Optimal Wellness Clinic, and people come in under the guise that they're being exposed to a health-promoting substance, but actually you expose them to flu germs, and you see what happens. Or you do experiments where you put healthy people and sick people directly in a room, but you tell people that they're being exposed to healthy people. And like, you just do all these different ways, these different methodologies of trying to work out how much of an effect the mind is having. Now, if all of that is true, and I believe that it is, I mean, this has been published in the peer-reviewed literature, what happens when you tell the population at large that there's something going around, they will experience these symptoms at this time, in this location, this is how long it's going to last for, blah, 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 blah. And it's on the news, it's on social media, it's on the radio, it's in every newspaper. You're being bombarded by this message. And now all of a sudden you're seeing people falling ill with these symptoms. Was it because they were
and
told
as a
to?
coordinated message.
That's right. So was there really a pandemic? Or was this just a pandemic of the nocebo effect, or expectation, or fear? There are many examples in the literature where this very thing has happened, not with the cold and flu, but with other illnesses. So we know that this is possible, that messages of fear in the media can induce certain conditions or diseases in people above and beyond the cold or flu. So no virus required, no contagion required.
Yes, which anybody that's listening and has done any research on their own and has a couple of ounces of common sense would probably right about now be putting two and two together and saying, well, if we're getting emergency produced vaccines that did not follow the scientific protocol for the production of vaccines and have been shown to be loaded with toxic, dangerous ingredients, ... and all the other stuff we could go into for hours, yet there's never been any physical virus ever produced. Many court cases have been thrown out because nobody can produce any physical evidence of the coronavirus. Then we have to say, well, what is really going on? Because if what you've just said is true, which I know as a clinician and a researcher myself for many years looking into these things, that this is, there's lots of evidence, which is what your book really shows, then you have to say, well, what kind of people are we dealing with that would orchestrate a brainwashing program, use the power of the mind against people, but then give them a vaccination that is now, based on different estimates, killed between 22 and 32 million people, depending on how you slice up the evidence or the reporting of it all. So, what's your comment in that one?
Yeah, I don't like to speculate about what might be going on there or what the motives are behind why this thing happens. It might just be an accident. It might just be human nature that's done this. It might be that there's a genuine misunderstanding, that we have just created this idea in our minds and it was wrong at the start, and now it's been sort of perpetuated through for so long that we all just believe it to be true, and there are no ill motives behind this. That it's very possible. Part of me tells me that that's not what's happening, that maybe there was some more nefarious intents and purposes behind why things like germ theory were sort of perpetuated in the first place. It turns out around the same time that germ theory was thrust upon the world that things like pesticides and plastics were invented around the very, very same time. Now, and I'm not saying that this is what's going on, but it's just a bit of a coincidence that when you start to expose the population at large to certain things like plastics, petrochemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, you start meddling with the food supply. And like if people were getting sick from that and they weren't sick before, they'd go, hang on a second, we weren't sick last week, but now ever since you started spraying poison on our food, now we're sick. Well, you got to stop that. They wouldn't stand for it. But if you can say, no, it's not the poison that we sprayed on your food. You see this little tiny microscopic thing on this orange? That's the thing that's making you sick. When you ate the orange, it had a germ on it, and now you're ill. Oh, so you mean it's not the poison? No, it's not the poison. It's the germ, right? So has germ theory been used as a scapegoat? Is it a red herring? Is it a distraction from the true problem? If we were never given this alternative idea about germ theory, our focus would have been on potentially these poisons and toxins and petrochemicals and things. Humanity wouldn't have stood for it, and it sort of would have been extinguished no sooner had it been unleashed onto humanity. So we may not have ever gotten to this point where we are now, where our environment is heavily polluted, our food is contaminated, our water is contaminated, our food is heavily refined and processed. Every basically industry is using petrochemicals, the building industry, the textile industry. I mean, it's everywhere. We never probably would have gotten to this point, and we would have been living sort of more harmoniously with nature and been more in tune and aware of how we treat the environment. So what were the reasons why this was done? I don't know. Was it an accident? Was it on purpose? I can't say for sure.
Well, you're being very kind, and that's cool. I have my own opinions, which I've shared many times on my podcast because I've done a lot of research into a lot of different areas. And when you see enough arrows pointing in the same direction, you say, hey, if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it smells like a duck, probably a duck.
I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I imagine you know that magnesium is one of the minerals that people in North America are the most deficient in, but it's an extremely important mineral to have in your diet regularly. And believe it or not, Bioptimizers has improved what was already well known to be the best magnesium formula out there called Magnesium Breakthrough. So I've got Wade Lightheart with me to explain what it is they've done to improve this already excellent formula. Wade, what is new about your new Mag Breakthrough formula?
Well, it's called sucrosomial magnesium. So we have 7 different types of magnesium in Magnesium Breakthrough because they're uptaken by different parts of the body. But a new type of magnesium has been created called sucrosomial. And what it shows in the research in science is that it's actually even more absorbable by the body, particularly inside of the brain, which is a big aspect to enhance neurotransmitter formation, as well as ensuring the rest and relax response in the nervous system that a lot of people will take magnesium for. They find it, clocks them down, helps them sleep better, allows for the relaxation of striated and smooth muscle tissue in the body, which creates an energetic relief. And so when we added sucrosomial, we were able to demonstrate inside our lab facility that we were able to get better improvements. Of course, we have a partnership with the Birch International University. We have some patents we're working on, which will kind of relay some of these things. But sucrosomial was a no-brainer when we added to the formula, improved the results or improved the uptake. And the reports back from our testing team were like, wow, we get more results with less caps. And that's always the goal for our company.
That's excellent. I love it. I always say, and people have probably heard me say it before, I just am so amazed how you guys are constantly and always improving and working your best to not only make better products for us, but it doesn't seem to me that it gets more expensive as you make them better. So that's a real gift to the world. Thank you.
Bioptimizers offers Living 4D with Paul Chek listeners 10% off Magnesium Breakthrough and all their other products. Plus, there are always amazing gifts with purchase. So to grab yours, go to bioptimizers.com/living4D and use the promo code Paul10 when you check out. That's bioptimizers.com/living, the number 4D, and the discount code is Paul10.
A couple things. One, as Andrew Kaufman points out and others, that the way the virus actually turns out to be the same issue with global warming. The way the viruses were created, all the different variations of the virus, be it Omicron or whatever they call them. I'm brain farting on the different viruses, but they kept saying, "Oh, this variation of the virus. Though you got to get your boosters and all this stuff." But as Dr. Kaufman pointed out, those things were all based on computer models. They were not actually based on laboratory studies of the mutation of viruses. And I recently heard a great podcast with Greg Braden and Danica Patrick on her show, looking into how it is they're coming up with the whole global warming information. Mm. And it turns out they're doing the same thing. It's not based on actual data. They're using computer modeling, and they're making predictions that have not only been wildly wrong, but continue to be wrong, yet promoting and selling this idea that we now know of as global warming. And so it's kind of like we're getting another assault for another massive windfall of profits. And it turns out to be the same people involved, interestingly enough. Mm. It goes right back to the World Economic Forum. It goes to the World Health Organization. It goes to the major corporations that stand to make money off of another one of these kind of global fiascos. But the key thing is a lot of people don't realize this data is not actual data. I've heard, for example, interviews with two very hardcore, seasoned meteorologists. One, his father was a meteorologist, and he personally has records that he has kept that go all the way back to 1840. And he said, we are not having a global warming issue. If anything, it's getting colder. In fact, he says the hottest day on record for the longest period of time since 1840 was in 1955. And I believe it was in the Chicago area, if I remember right. It's been probably a year since I listened to the podcast with the guy. But I've heard two different podcasts with two different meteorologists, both very, very experienced, both who have kept a lot of records and have access to them, pointing out very clearly that what we're being told is not correct. What this points to is that we have to become a lot more adult and a lot more disciplined in doing our own research, asking better questions. I teach my students, you must learn how to think holistically. And to do that, at minimum, you must always answer these questions: who, what, why, where, when, and how. So if you take, for example, the vaccine issue, any vaccine, who does it apply to? What is it for? Why do you need to take it? How does it work? When should it be used? And how is it made? These are minimal questions that people rarely ever ask. And when people have gotten in the habit of turning to mainstream media, all of which is owned by 6 corporations, all of which are in the pool of corporations that make a huge amount of money off all this stuff, all of which make most of their money from selling marketing to drug companies, you start to see a picture emerge, and it's an important picture. So people essentially have to stop being so lazy. And that's why I love getting guys like you that have written good books on the podcast, because you've actually given us in one book enough research that most people would never spend the time, nor would they even mostly know how to find all that research, nor would they know how to interpret it effectively without somebody with your clinical background and education to make it clear to the average person what that research really says. But the key point I'm making is we have to be very, very conscious that there's a lot of money being made using very advanced technology to trick people into believing the kinds of things that ultimately can lead them to not only creating illnesses and diseases through the power of their own mind because they believe it, but going broke, losing jobs, having broken families. You may not be aware of this, but I did research a few months ago for a podcast I was putting together, maybe 8 or 10 months ago now. But I found in my research that the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical expenses, not overspending, not credit card debt, not foolish spending, but people who have such high medical expenses that it completely wipes out their savings, their kids' college funds, and they can no longer survive and they have to file bankruptcies. And so when you look at the magnitude of the amount of money being taken from people on false pretenses, on being misled, and on the kinds of things that your book is pointing out, it is very, very expensive not to have the discipline to really dig in and do the research and look for people like we mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, people with clinical experience, people with open mind, people that are truly scientific. And one of the things that was very concerning to me during the pandemic, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, is that what was being pawned off as science was not science at all. It was not science in any way, shape, or form. Yet we had people like Anthony Fauci and many others on television. The science says this, the science says that. They were using that as part of their brainwashing slogan because people believe it's actually science. But science is the pursuit of the truth. And that requires that you have to put away any bias, no matter what the evidence says. And science is not based on manufacturing evidence to bolster your purchased illusion. Science is the real pursuit of truth. I did not hear very many, if any, scientists at all ringing the bell saying, wait a minute, this is not science. And why this was concerning me is because that leverage, this is backed by science, was used so often. And now there's so much evidence of all the bullshit that what concerned me deeply is this threatens to undermine the credibility of real science and real scientists. Because if we're not careful, we're going to get to the point any day now where people don't trust science at all. And when you've got so much of this illusion generating going on, you've got AI that can now generate all sorts of data and it's hard to tell where it's coming from. We can get to the point where nobody knows what the truth is. And it gets to the point where how do you know what a real scientist is from a corporate prostitute? And, you know, the old saying, it's very hard to change a man's belief system when his paycheck depends on it. That's another thing. You know, I looked into earlier in my career, I looked into why does a dysfunctional medical system keep running? Like, why obviously, you know, we've known that our medical system is not only the most expensive, but one of the worst in the world for a very long time now. And it's been its ranking in the world rankings of medical effectiveness is going lower and lower consistently. I mean, when I started my career, I think we were ranked probably 10 or 11, 41 years ago. Now we're down to something like 66 or lower. And it's gotten more and more and more expensive. And you know, people are not like asking questions. So I did some investigations and asked the question, why do we continue to fund a completely dysfunctional medical system that's draining massive amounts of money out of taxpayers' wallets and personal income to pay for insurance policies, to pay for co-pays, et cetera, et cetera. And what I found out was that the medical system, the amount of money brought in through medical procedures turns out to be one of the highest taxable incomes of all industries in the world. In other words, what I'm saying is if there was enough people like me, you, Andrew Kaufman, Tom Cowan, Sherry Tenpenny, Sayer G, Kelly Brogan, if there was enough of us out there to actually wake people up to the truth, and we switched back to natural medicine and the medical industry collapsed as we know it, the research I did showed that it would collapse the entire economical structure because there's that much money coming in off all this garbage medical stuff. Not to say that there's not great surgeons out there. I've got friends that are great doctors and great surgeons. And I think that, you know, those are the people we also didn't hear enough of during the pandemic because everybody was afraid they were going to, you know, lose their job or get their license stripped. But to me, that's the difference between a real warrior and a cop-out. I've even got a friend who's an orthopedic surgeon who came back from a trip to Colombia and got quite sick and was treated so absolutely ridiculously badly in the hospital. He was actually like bordering on going comatose. It was so bad his wife had to go into the hospital and go directly to the director of the hospital to inform the director personally of what was going on, because no matter how many phone calls she made, they were not taking her seriously. And he was actually a surgeon in that hospital, and they didn't even know who he was and treated him like absolute trash, left him for 24 hours with no food, no water, not even an IV drip, nothing. And the guy was practically dying. To make it worse, one of the nurses or orderlies took his phone and was sending very foul, nasty text messages from his phone to somebody else while this guy was incapacitated. And she literally brought the phone to the hospital director and said, look, this is what's been going on my husband's phone in your hospital. And so the point I'm making is we have a completely and utterly dysfunctional medical system, but it links back to this industrial machine. And we really are in a point of our own, shall we say, the evolution of whatever you want to call it, capitalism or free market economy, where we really have to think carefully about what is the value of a service, what is the value of money, and what are we really actually upholding, what needs to collapse. If you look at nature, destruction is part of the creation process. A fire comes, it wipes out the forest, kills many animals, but it refertilizes the soil, and the ash becomes the basis of a much more lush forest. You can see that anywhere where there's been a forest fire. So destruction is often part of a creative process. And I think we're at the point right now where we're in this kind of tricky situation where we know that government needs to be retooled. We know that medicine needs to be retooled. We know education needs to be retooled. We know science has been toyed with and what I was alluding to earlier. Irvin Laszlo says, Paul, what you're referring to as science is not science. He says, these are not scientists. They're technicians promoting themselves and being pawned off as science. But these technicians are not doing science. They work for corporations, and they're using the disguise of science to sell shit to people that is not based on science. It's based on what they want you to believe, and they're using science. So we have to retool what science is. We have to retool the public's opinion of and understanding of what science is. And that's just the beginning of a list. You could go into the environmental issues. We can talk about herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, rodenticides, Roundup. There's now been, I would guess, at least 40 lawsuits where Monsanto or Bayer has been fined, millions and millions of dollars because Roundup caused cancer. There's so many studies showing that Roundup is poisonous and causes cancer. I couldn't read them all. I recently read on Children's Health Defense that they've just approved a new version of Roundup through the FDA that is 90 times more toxic than the last one. Okay, so how on earth do we have a Food and Drug Administration that's ignoring all this research, that's allowing them to produce a chemical that's 90 times more toxic than the one that has already gotten them about 50 lawsuits that they've lost? I mean, when you start looking at this, you look at the Oxycontin and fentanyl. I mean, the list is so friggin' long. You're talking about literally trillions of dollars coming from the manipulation, greed, and abuse of humanity. You're talking about the destruction of our environment. I recently saw a documentary where it showed very clearly that there's putting glyphosate in chemtrails. I saw a documentary showing that they're spraying national forests all over the world with glyphosate and other chemicals. I mean, what are you doing using what's supposed to be weed control in the middle of forests where you're completely and utterly destroying the microbiome of the soil? So without, going too far, you understand what I'm saying. Like, we're facing something that has to collapse, but I think we don't really have any leadership on how do we make a transition. If we don't get people with the intelligence, I mean, people like you that are writing good books, that's the first step, is awareness, right? First, we have to have the awareness. But somehow, like, I used to be in the 82nd Airborne Division. So when you go into a battle, you have a battle plan. There's battle strategy. You don't just jump in and start shooting at people. You have to know what you're doing, or you get killed. So somewhere along the line, we have to have people that realize that we're walking on a gangplank, and we're not only humans, but we're taking the whole planet with us. And we have to have some way to orchestrate a plan that's about morals, it's about ethics, and it's about responsibility to each other and to the planet. I'm just curious what your thoughts are in that regard.
There's many sort of good points that you raised there, Paul. The first thing that comes to mind is that the very fabric of society hinges and rests upon this idea that germs make people ill. Because if it was ever demonstrated and I believe that it has beyond all doubt, that germs are not the cause of illness, it means that there's something else making people sick.
Yeah, we can get into that a little later too.
So if it's not a germ that's making people sick, what is it? When our attention moves there, that's a big problem, because every single, let's just assume for a moment that it is the poisons in the food and the air and the water and the destruction of the environment and our disconnection with nature and working slave jobs, 9 to 5, 50 hours a week, just disconnection with family, all of these things, a lack of purpose and meaning in our lives, all these things that we need and require as human beings, that is making us sick. So it's the lack of things that we need and then being poisoned. Our attention would then go away from a germ if we found out that it was not the case that germs are the cause of disease. Our attention would go towards finding what the causes really are. We would soon be asking questions about various industries as to why they're doing such things, why they're using certain chemicals, why they're doing certain practices, like in the agricultural section, for example, monocrop farming, yada, yada, yada. Each of those industries, the pharmaceutical industry, the textile industry, the building industry, the technological industry, the IT industry, the automotive industry, every single industry would have to change what they're doing overnight if it was found that actually it's the toxic petrochemicals and all these things that they're using as a part of the products that they make and that they offer to the population. They would have to change their ways and come up with greener, more natural alternatives pretty quickly, almost overnight, or they would fall. Now, I don't actually think that they can do that, because it would mean, as you said, the total collapse of not only the economy, but I think of society as a whole. So everything rests upon this idea being true. Now, is there a way for us to change the way that we're doing things now slowly over time so that we can get to a point where we are doing things that are more conducive to the well-being of not only human beings, but every single living organism or in this realm? I think there is a way that we can do that, but it's going to take time. So we have to transition slowly. Otherwise, the change is going to be so abrupt, we literally see doomsday, Armageddon. It's the end. It's the end of society, of our very existence as we know it. People would be rioting in the streets if they understood that, hang on, it's not a germ making me sick, so why have you been injecting me and my family and my children for, generations, and it's caused untold damage and whatever. I mean, there's not enough money in the world to pay reparations for that. And then people start asking questions, why are we using, petrochemicals in automobiles, and you're polluting the air, it's making you sick, you got to stop. People wouldn't stand for it. Now, I know that a lot of people want to see change and they want to see it happen quickly or immediately. But if we rip the Band-Aid off too quickly, Paul, we're going to be in a bit of strife. So I think what we are witnessing now is the unraveling, is the systematic destruction of this old system. It's reached its use-by date. People are already sort of waking up and are aware that something's not right. So what we are witnessing now is the system falling apart. Yes, it's taking time, but I think it has to, for us to keep some sense of normalcy and sort of keep society where it is. Otherwise, we're just going to regress to the dark ages, and it's going to be like all hell will break loose. The other thing I will say is, you mentioned science. And when it comes to things like germ theory, the actual science, the real science, is very clear. And it was very clear almost as soon as this theory was incepted, that germs don't cause illness. Even people like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch disproved themselves very shortly after they put this idea forward. For example, there is a thing called a systematic review, which essentially looks at all of the important literature for a given topic and analyzes it to see whether or not there is any meaningful effect, if there's any significant effect of a particular intervention. Should we keep continuing doing X, Y, Z? Yes or no? How do we know that? Look at all the data, analyze it. It gives us a sort of aggregate result, gives us a broad overview. A systematic review has been done for almost any topic you can think of in medicine. You take like particular surgeries or particular drugs or particular interventions or whatever. There's been a systematic review on just about every single thing. One thing that you will not find a systematic review on is contagion. Not one has ever been done where someone has gone through the literature and taken all of the experiments where sick people have been exposed to healthy people and seen what happens. That's never been done in medicine. That should ring alarm bells to people. Why hasn't it been done? Because if it was, it would be clear proof that the phenomenon of contagion is not a real thing. It doesn't happen.
Do you think it's never
So if
been
that was
done, or it's just
published,
never been published?
well, that's the other thing, right? Has it been done and it's just never been published? Like, as far as I can tell, my book is like the first attempt to ever do that. It's the first attempt that's been published to ever look at this problem. Now, if this has been done and it hasn't been published, that's as much of a problem as it never being done, because it means that there's information.
Suppression of the information, not a lack of interest or intention by authors or researchers, but people get killed for creating cures for cancer and all sorts of stuff. I don't know if you've ever read the book The Politics of Healing by Dan Haley, but have you heard of that book?
I've not, no.
Well, it documents, I think, a dozen cases of doctors that came up for cures for cancer and various diseases, and shortly after filing a patent or putting their cures out, mysteriously were found with a suicide note and dead. And in every single case, their family said there's absolutely no way in hell this person would have committed suicide. They were far too successful, passionate, in love with their life, their family, their work. There's been over 30 doctors mysteriously killed in Germany just in the last few years, based on some of the research that I've done, for the same reasons. I'm bringing that up because, something as obvious as that. I mean, I don't think you're the first person to ever come to these conclusions by any means. I just think that there are nefarious forces with a very careful screen for sifting through all of this information. Look how much censorship went on through the pandemic, and probably still is going on at some significant level.
Yeah, these are all things that it's important to be aware of, that there is suppression of information. And why can't we have this discussion openly and honestly? Because if society was holding science to such a high regard, we call ourselves a sort of scientific society, that the things that we do and the decisions that we make are based upon science and the evidence as a whole, and certainly empirical evidence that we can actually determine and detect with our own senses, that should be the cornerstone of how we make decisions that benefit society as a whole. If we can't have these discussions, if information is suppressed, well, we don't live in that society. We actually live in a society that's antithetical to science, that it's got something to hide. And when it has something to hide, it means that if the truth were to come to light, there would be some interests that would be potentially damaged. As you said before, nature is self-correcting. It goes through cycles. Even if we never have this conversation about germs and whatever, if it's never a non-issue and we just let the system go for as long as it possibly can, it can't go on forever, because we are doing things that we're essentially at war with nature. And you can only fight against nature for so long until it bites back in a big way and self-corrects itself. So we can keep going down this path that we're on now, and we will see the repercussions of that in 5, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. I don't know. But it's not very long until we see some major changes in the way nature is doing things to deal with the onslaught that humanity is raging against it. And then we will see course correction anyway. So it matters not if we really have these conversations now. If we don't, we will see nature right itself eventually. Anyway, the reason why I think these conversations are important is that we can open up these channels of discourse, have an open, honest discussion, say, right, what are the challenges that face us as a population, and what are the things that we can do to minimize the fallout of this system that is on the verge of basically self-imploding? Can we soften the blow? Can we reduce the fallout and the damage that occurs when it eventually does collapse? Can we start to look at ways of doing things better so that we can continue to feed ourselves and house ourselves and do all these things when the industries that provide these goods and services to us now aren't around anymore. And I think a lot of people are doing that with things like regenerative agriculture and looking at the way that they look after themselves, looking at health differently, looking at using different building materials to create housing, more natural alternatives. There's a lot of things out there that are happening that are moving towards this sort of, or moving in this direction. And this is sort of the reason why I'm doing this work, is to say, look, we need to change what we're doing. Whether or not there is a germ, it's really of very little consequence. It will certainly help people change their understanding and get us to that end point a little bit quicker. But whether or not there is a germ or not, I don't think is of that much consequence for many reasons, and we can sort of talk about that. But yeah, we're not living in a society that prides itself on truth. We're not living in a society that prides itself on real science, and it shows.
Well, guess what? Drew Cannoli is sitting here right here with me, and I'm going to try to sell him on Organifi's green juice. Drew, you got to try this stuff. My kids love it. I love it. And for a lot of people that are too busy to get good shop and find, proper organic greens, it's the way to go. It's fast, it's easy, and it tastes good.
Yep.
But since you made it, why don't you tell everyone else about it?
Yeah. So one of the things that Organifi strives for is transparency in labels.
That's a good idea.
We almost have 4 grams of the greens, organic greens, and then 3 grams of the superfood blend. Not to mention 600 milligrams of ashwagandha.
Yes.
300 milligrams is the clinical dose for lowering stress. And when we're not stressed out, we don't crave food. Right,
you don't crave junk.
You don't crave junk.
Yeah.
And because you don't crave junk, it actually helps support weight loss.
Yeah.
So naturally, and this is the first green juice that was, with the ashwagandha in it, and now it's glyphosate residue free. It's amazing.
You know what I like about this and all of your juice mixes of this style? 1, they taste good. 2, I can get up out of my chair and in 32 seconds, I can have something that tastes good and feels good in my body and actually contributes to my mental stability and my ability to get work done, or to my weightlifting, or to my overall physiological adaptation to the stress of life.
Yeah, when we're stressed out, we don't produce testosterone as men.
Yes,
as much.
Shuts it way down.
So the ashwagandha helps with that. And one of my favorite mentors told me that it's a bioharmonizer.
It's a bioharmonizer for sure. We don't do biohacking around here. And that's why I love your products, because they are bioharmonizers. And that's what we all need, right? So
absolutely.
Thank you to Organifi and you for making such great products. I really love sharing them on my podcast, and my kids and my family use them daily. So this is the real deal. So if you want to get your green juice, you can go to Organifi, ORGANIFI.com/CHEK20. And on checkout, use the code CHEK20. You get 20% off, and that's a damn good
family
deal.
discount.
And your whole family will be the better for it. And you will enjoy the taste and feel good and know that you're doing something that your doctor won't do for you.
Absolutely.
Aho, great spirit.
Aho.
Aho. Thanks, buddy. There's 2 things that I wrote down while you were talking there. What we're dealing with when we have controls imposed upon us, as we had in the pandemic, in the name of science, and we're having issues with a lack of scientific authenticity and morality and values and ethics, which has clearly been going on for quite some time, as we've just been discussing, then we have to come face to face with what a scientocracy is. And there's many books that have been written over, all the way back to as far as 100 years ago, warning that scientists would ultimately be the ones that took the world over and would be more powerful than governments, and that we would be in a scientocracy. We need to be extremely conscious of exactly what that means, because we've just spent 4 years experiencing exactly the power of a scientocracy and how dangerous that can be. And when you look at issues like the transgender movement and transhumanism, when you see how much of this transgender stuff has infiltrated the United States government, the media, but then you find out from experts that it's something like 0.5% of the world population that's even interested or involved in any of this, you then have to say, okay, why is the amount of airtime and influence and the amount of billions of dollars being spent to try to convince people that maybe they're the wrong sex and put porn books in children's schools as early as first grade, and the kind of shit that's been going on in the last 4 years is mind-boggling. And so you're dealing with social engineering at such a high power with such a sort of a twisted orientation that, I mean, for example, I found that it costs between $50 and $100,000 a year, depending on what type of surgery you have for transgender sex change, for the rest of your life to manage all the hormones and all the drugs they've got to take to maintain that. So, what a lot of people in the public don't realize is these things are much more stealth than they look like. You hear conversations, my brother got a sex change or whatever. But what you don't realize is that that's pumping medical money into the medical system. I mean, when I was a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division, it was tricky if you were gay at all. I mean, if anyone even found out about that could really be intense. You don't want to go down that road. But now we've got commanders that are blatantly crossing over, and I'm not saying that I have any bias toward as far as I'm concerned, be what you want to be. But what I do get very concerned about is when people are being put in positions of power that often should not be there because they're not qualified to be there, but they're being put there by people that have an ulterior motive and an agenda that's making a small number of rich people very, very rich. And I looked into this whole thing without going into a whole transgender thing. It turns out to just be a handful of people that got behind this idea and have worked together with some major corporations to really infect the planet with this whole concept. And why I'm bringing that up is because this is really, again, the influence that a scientocracy can have and how you can manipulate the minds of people using social media, using fifth generation warfare, which is mind control, using false statistics, etc. So that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up is the issue of scientocracy that people need to be really concerned about and aware about. And one of my friends has written multiple books on these issues, and he's extremely well researched on it. And he's been on my podcast like 4 times, James Tunney. If you haven't listened to any of my podcasts with James Tunney, they're very eye-opening. The other issue is about the fact that we can't pull the Band-Aid off too quick is a real factor because it could collapse society. But, I'm sure, Daniel, you're smart enough to realize that we are greasing the guillotine. We're racing the clock. Because if you look at, if I literally sat here and gave you all the statistics that I'm aware of from my own research, from soil issues to environmental issues, to water issues, to atmospheric issues, to chemical changes in the ocean, to poisoning of the oceans, to the loss of topsoil, and the list goes on. Here's one for you. I've mentioned it on my podcast before, but it's relevant right now. Entomologists noticed several years ago that bug traffic was dropping all over the world to significantly lower levels. And it became a concern because, as you know, insects are the sex organs of this planet, of nature. And so a team of 50 entomologists worldwide got together and they did a worldwide study to monitor bug traffic and compare it to records from the past. And I've got an article right in my library, and the title of it is Armageddon May Be Near. They showed that in the last 50 years, bug traffic has dropped 75% worldwide. And now you've got Bill Gates up to all his crazy shit. You've got all this genetic modification going on. If you read some of the scientific papers I've gotten about what happens when you put genetically modified organisms into nature and they start crossbreeding, David Suzuki did a shocking demonstration on what happens if you start mixing genetically modified salmon with the actual salmon in the ocean. And he showed, I can't remember, I think it was, I'm guessing now, but I think it's within 400 cycles of rebreeding that the entire species will go extinct. And what he showed is that the genetically modified males are so much bigger, but the genetics of the females is they're attracted to the size of the males. And so what happens with the genetically modified salmon is that the females start getting more and more preferential to less and less males. And the next thing you know, the reproduction cycle starts to collapse and then you lose the whole species. I agree with what you're saying, but we're playing a very, very dangerous game because the question is, can nature keep us alive long enough to get our head out of our ass and clean up the mess and do what we've got to do? And yeah, you're right. There will be a course correct. The question is, are we going to like it when there's no fruit and vegetables growing anymore? We really have to, one, it's evident to me that all this religious stuff's not working very well because we haven't got any indication that we've become more moral or ethical at all after thousands of years of so-called religion, which has also been used to hijack people's minds. And when during COVID, you had the Pope, you had preachers and pastors all over the world saying God wants you to get vaccinated, which is just absolute horseshit. We're at a point as a species where we've really got to find our moral fabric and get back to some common sense and get clear on what supports us. People don't realize there's 3 days of food and water supply in most supermarkets worldwide. So if we have an event that lasts longer than 3 days, you're going to have millions of people running around that'll do almost anything for food. And that could be Mad Max for real. Now you've got something very, very ugly and devastating. And so what's happening? People are being pacified constantly with exotic movies and exotic social media and distraction. And so it's kind of like people are being drugged into submission. Now, the question I ask, and I'd like to ask you, where do these people think their children get their food? Where do they think they're going to live? What do they think they're going to drink and eat? And what are they going to breathe? These chemtrails don't mysteriously miss Bill Gates's atmosphere, etc. So either we have degenerated to the point where the smartest people in society and the most conniving people in society are so stupid they're willing to kill everybody because they think they're getting rich off it, but don't realize that they're greasing the guillotine that's going to cut their own heads off. Study Weston A. Price's Francis Marion Pottinger's Pottinger cat study and look at what happened just by feeding cooked food. By the 4th generation, these cats went extinct. Well, we've been eating highly processed food for far more than 4th generations, and everything that he pointed out in his cats, I've seen over and over again in my clinical practice, and there's no question it's happening. But anyhow, I'm sorry I have to share these things, but
No, I think you're right, and I agree, Paul, and that's why I said this is the most important issue of our time, because we do have a chance. We have an opportunity right now to do something about these issues. And, is it about money? I'm not so sure. I think it runs deeper than that because they can print as much money as they want, right? So, I think what we're seeing
they don't
is
even
that
have to print it; they just make it up.
They just make it up out of thin air. So, I don't know if it's so much about money. I think it's about there's something deeper. We are being distracted about the real problems and the real issues. How long can we be distracted for? Will we be able to be distracted long enough for things to get so bad that everything basically ceases to exist? I don't know. I can't foresee the future, but what my intention, what my purpose is, I believe, in this life is to do what I'm doing and make as many people aware about the potential issues as I see them, as like what you're doing. You're doing an amazing job. And it only takes the work that we're doing to wake up the right person. So, in the like the Terminator movies, there's John Connor. He's the guy that saves everybody, just one man. So maybe it's not our role to wake up everybody. Maybe it's just our role just to wake up the right person, and then our job is done. So,
or people,
I don't know,
even a handful, yeah.
The right handful of people, and there's many things that work in our favor. But one of these things that works in our favor is this idea of contagion. So contagion doesn't happen through like disease spread, but there is a phenomenon called social contagion where emotions can spread. And we know that things like fear or anger or whatever else can spread between people, but so does things like happiness. And so do many different human emotions. Now, people might say, what is the point in me changing? Because I'm just one person, and therefore I'm just not even going to bother because the problem's too big and I'm just going to leave it to its own devices and let the chips fall where they may. That's what they want us to believe. Because if we actually understand that no, what I believe, what I feel, what I think actually matters, if you change your perspectives and you start doing things that are more in line with living in harmony with nature, and you're happier and you're healthier and you're wiser and you stand for good things and you change your morals, that actually then spreads to other people in your direct social circle. And then if they make those changes and they're inspired by you, their changes will influence other people and other people and other people. So one person making a change could potentially affect 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people in a positive way. But if we're all living in fear and we're all worried and we're all sort of this negative mindset that resistance is futile and there's no point in doing any of these things and the war is already lost, then we're going to end up there. But we can actually use that social contagion phenomena that has been demonstrated to be a real thing to our advantage. And it just takes a few key people to change the way that they're doing things. They will inspire others, and that will eventually filter through to the rest of the population. And we don't have to wake up everybody. I think we only need 5-10% of the population, and that will be enough for critical mass. We don't need to get to 51%. So getting there, I think, is a lot easier than we're led to believe. And it's actually something that I think we're seeing the beginnings of now. So these discussions that we're having, the information that's coming out, this is the beginning of the new reality that we want to see. And that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Seeing that Trump's put RFK in the position of, I think what it is, a health secretary or in charge of health. I don't know what the exact title is, but he's got the power now to clean up a lot. I've been seeing articles come out about what does that actually mean if he does that. And, he's going to get a lot of resistance. In fact, by doing what he wants to do, which is absolutely essential that he does do, he certainly puts himself right in the crosshairs of many corporations that are not immune to removing problems like that. So, we have to surround him with angels. There's a philosopher, I believe his name is H.T. Ert, who said a little bit of lies spread regularly for just 10 years can wipe out 100 years of truth. And I believe that that's true. But if that's true, the inverse must also be true, that a little bit of truth spread regularly for just 10 years can wipe out 100 years of lies. And I think that's why these conversations are so important, because it's very realistic that 50,000 people will listen to this podcast. They'll hear you. A percentage of them are going to buy your book. They're going to hear me. I've sold I think I've sold 250,000 copies of How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy now. So that's a lot of books, and
Congratulations.
There's over.
It's fantastic.
Thank you. There's over 63,000 Chek professionals worldwide. That's a lot of influence. There's that, but then there's also research I wanted to share with you and the listeners, because what you just said is very important. It's not like we have to get to a 51% participation to tip the scales. Research by HeartMath, and I believe also the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I've actually seen interviews with scientists working in this field of consciousness, and they stated that 2 million people in a state of coherence produces an effect that's greater than 6 billion people in a state of incoherence. And they've learned this by doing studies with meditators and monitoring their brains and their biorhythms and seeing what happens when groups of people meditate together, and using things like random event generators. But anyhow, they've been able to calculate the data. So really, based on that data, we only need, let's call it for safety's sake, 3 to 5 million people to come into coherence and realize everything we're talking about and start moving in that direction. And the sort of the domino effect of that would potentially ripple right through society. And we know these things are possible because they've used this to create all sorts of movements, from fashion industry to music movements to political movements to COVID, right? You get enough people moving and the whole thing, and then next thing you know, you're a bad guy for even proposing the truth. And one of the things I tell my students, look, you should be able to teach in your underwear. It doesn't matter what your degree is. It doesn't matter how fancy the words you use are. You should be comfortable teaching in your underwear so everyone out there can see the results of your own philosophy, your own practice, because then you have the evidence. And then no matter how, it's 5 years to go through the Chek Academy. It's a really comprehensive education. And I've got many naturopathic physicians, medical doctors, nurses, chiropractors, you name it. They're acupuncturists. So it's people that are very, very intelligent that really want to understand holistic health. But I tell them all the time, as deep as this training is, at the end of the day, what you're ultimately doing is really only one thing. You're just teaching people how you lost the weight, how you got yourself healthy so you're not suffering from illnesses and colds and diseases and all this crap, because many of them come in as unhealthy people, but they get very healthy. I've seen several of them lose over 100 pounds fairly reasonably fast, not dangerously fast, but consistently. And so I think if more of us just show the results, like I have not missed a day of work due to illness in my entire professional career. And I've worked with sick people my entire career. I have people coughing on me and vomiting and you name it. I've seen it all. And people have asked me, how come you never get sick? And I simply say, I don't believe I need to get sick. I don't have the time to get sick. I don't have the interest in being sick. I love what I do. So I don't, at an unconscious or a conscious level, need an illness to give me a break. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we've got to look at too, because research shows, one study I looked at said that 75% of people interviewed in, I believe it was the United States, said they hated their job. And in Europe, it was 70%. So we've actually got to start taking responsibility for our psychological health. And I tell people, look, if you do what you love to do every day, you go to work and make love all day. But if you do what you don't love to do or don't want to do because you've been convinced that's what you got to do to make money, or you've convinced yourself, then you have to come home and you got to drink alcohol or smoke pot or do something, get lost in video games to create an alternate reality so you can get a break from the reality that you keep negating your own responsibility for having created. People that are in love are naturally creative. They're naturally intelligent. They're naturally explorative. But we've got this whole kind of factory farm type industrial society where people are sitting at desks and these kind of assembly line type jobs where they're doing just shit all day long that has no purchase power in their heart, no esprit de corps. You start looking at the statistics on how many people are on psychotropic drugs. I believe Basil van der Kolk in his book showed something like 47% of the world population is taking psychotropic drugs for some kind of psychological illness. And I may not be exactly right on the stats, but it was so high it about knocked me out of my chair. Like, these indicators are that we need a revival at a spiritual level. We need a revival of what is meaning. We need a revival of what does it mean to be human? What is the difference between spirituality and religion? Well, spirituality, simply stated, is a progressive connection, connecting to a progressively larger whole. So you realize that who you are is not just your family or just your race or your color or your job, but you're actually part of the environment. You can't be here without the water. You can't be here without the sky. You can't be here without the sun. So when you realize, wow, who I am is dependent upon the sun, the moon, the earth, and the stars. And you say, well, if that's true, then none of those could be here without the galaxy. And so eventually you realize that there's an entire cosmos behind each of us. And so when we connect to a progressively larger whole, we have this greater and greater sense of self-realization to realize that there's something so magnificent and so powerful and so beautiful going on that we need to get off of our iPhones and start looking at the stars again. We got to get off of our junk television and start looking at each other and celebrating each other. And instead of watching the bad news hour, we got to start having good news hours and celebrating and learning about who lost a bunch of weight and who got over their back pain and how did they do it, and celebrating that and learning that way. Like, I don't know what more I can do. I don't know what more you can do, but I just hope that my dream is that in my lifetime that enough of us wake up and become positive influences, that the domino effect reaches critical mass so that we can actually start all of a sudden seeing, hey, we got to protect farmers. We got to protect the soil. We got to protect real doctors, and we got to figure out how do we determine what a real doctor is. Develop a web-based system so that the holistic doctors can be found and the holistic soil scientists can be found, and the, biodynamic farmers that can teach you how to protect your gardens and your farms from pests without using dangerous chemicals can be found. And our education systems get a revival so that we're not being brainwashed by corporations. We're actually being taught how to think instead of what to think, which is why I have my kids in a Waldorf school system, because Steiner's education system is, I don't think there's a better system out there. I've looked all over the world. I can't find a better system. So I've noticed since COVID, I think it was quite a slap in the face for a lot of people. It was quite a harsh wake-up call for a lot of people. I've seen a lot of medical doctors who have come out that were very, very pro-vaccine and very aggressive, and even saying things like, these anti-vaxxers should be locked in prison, and some saying kill them and whatever, have actually done a 180-degree turn now that the evidence is, undeniable. So I think that we're in kind of a great revolution of awakening to things that really matter. So I think there are some very, very positive things that have come out of that. And you're a naturopathic physician. I'm sure you've had cases where, someone gets cancer and it's just what it took to get them back grounded in reality and what holism is. And I've seen people that I know in my own social circles that got diabetes and for the first time started eating well, going to the gym, and changed their whole life. But it took a disease to, deliver the reality check that they needed. And I think really we could call what's going on in the world the disease that's waking us up. And the question, as we were discussing earlier, is can we wake up and make changes intelligently without destroying the fabric of culture, without destroying the fabric of nature? And that, I think, is really the issue of our day.
I think we can. I think we've probably been here before. I don't think what we're going through now is something new. So this is just a cycle. And I view everything that's happened as a blessing in disguise. I think this is necessary for humanity to go through this, for us to learn what we don't want, how we don't want the world to be. And the only way you can get there is by experiencing the things that feel uncomfortable and seeing the world in a state of dis-ease or disarray and learning from that and going, right, we did things this way. It didn't really work. It wasn't enjoyable. It wasn't how we wanted the world to be. So let's learn from that and make the world a better place. So we have to go through this experience. It is necessary for us to become more aware, for us to reconnect. So as I said, I think we've been here before. It's not so long ago that we were connected to nature. We've just lost that connection for one reason or another. And now it's time for us to reconnect. And that's really important for many reasons. And one reason that comes to mind is that you mentioned before about what a doctor really is. And you also mentioned about the importance of education. Now, the word doctor means teacher.
Yeah, in Latin.
Exactly. Now, if a doctor is a teacher, why would we call them a teacher? It would insinuate that the curriculum has already been written, that a doctor already knows what to teach. Now, I believe that that's true. I don't think health is a big mystery. I don't think it's something that's unattainable. I don't think reversing disease is a big mystery. I actually think it's very simple. Once you view health and disease and the world around us through a different lens. So it does seem very complicated and difficult and challenging and almost impossible when you look at the world and health through this germ theory lens. But once you look at through it in a different way, a few key things become apparent. And I was only able to get there when I actually quit my job and sort of just took a moment out of that rat race and sat quietly by myself for a while outside in nature and started having downloads of information come to me, and I could philosophize and think about things, and it all became very clear. But I couldn't get there whilst I was in a part of that system, and that's probably another reason why the system's designed the way it is to keep people confused and unable to really reason and logic their way through things. If we look at disease and health through a different lens, one thing becomes immediately apparent is that we already know what people need to thrive and survive. This is written in the old natural medicine, naturopathic textbooks. This information we arrived at over hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at the pinnacle of medicine in the mid to late 1900s, even though we're told that it was like the Dark Ages and no one knew anything and we were incredibly stupid. The way that they looked at medicine was that there are certain things a human body needs to thrive and survive. And if you don't have those things, then the body is going to be in a state of imbalance. It needs all of those certain essential things to remain in a state of homeostasis or balance. And these things aren't a mystery. I mean, you could ask a 5-year-old child what a person needs to be healthy. It's the same as what a tree needs to be healthy.
Exactly.
It needs some fresh water, some clean air, some
Sunshine.
good soil, sunshine, companionship. It needs to be outside. It needs to be connected to the elements. It needs good food, et cetera, et cetera. I think humans above and beyond that, we need meaning and purpose. We need each other. So we need to have meaningful connection.
Creativity.
We need, all of these things like good quality sleep. Now, if you don't have one or all of those things, so let's say you have a plant in a pot and it's not getting sun and it's not getting water, and the plant's looking really sickly. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that you need to give the plant some water and some sun, and it will correct itself. It has an innate ability to heal itself.
Not a vaccination.
Same thing with you don't need to be injecting things into the plant to make it healthy. You just need to give it what it's lacking. So same sort of premise as what these old doctors had. And the way you can look at this really simply about how to achieve and maintain good health is to understand what the key things are that a person needs. And then you basically do an audit of your life. You go, am I ticking all the boxes? Am I getting sun? Am I getting fresh air? Am I moving my body? Am I eating clean food, et cetera, et cetera? Now, if you only tick, let's say there's 10 things. I don't know if there's exactly 10. I think there's about 8 from what I've worked out, but we'll just say 10 because it's easy for the sake of conversation. And let's say you're only doing 6 of those things. You're not going to be healthy. So if you're not getting sunlight and you're not eating fresh food, for example, you need to get into the sun. You need to eat healthy food before the body can heal itself. If you don't do those things, you can't go and achieve health through some sort of fancy intervention or a surgery or a drug or some other thing. You have to give the body the things that it is lacking so that it can do what it needs to do. So you just do that basic audit of your life. Oh, I've only ticked 5 out of 10 boxes. So the doctor would do that for you. And they go, look, Mr. Jones, you're only doing 5 of the 10 things. Here are the other 5 things that are essential and crucial for life. And let's develop a plan so that we can get you changing your diet and modifying your lifestyle and get you to the point in 6-12 months where you are doing all of these things all the time so that you are healthy. And that's essentially the role of a doctor. The doctor's role is not, oh my God, health is a big mystery. It's so complicated. There's all these unknowns. We have no idea what's going on. And now we've got to look deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper inside the human body to find the answer. Because the answer doesn't lie inside of us. It actually lies outside of us in nature. Because nature essentially has everything that we need to survive and give us life. And this is a reason why, if you look at the health of native people, why there's so few diseases, there's so little chronic illness. They're relatively healthy compared to people living in the West, because by very virtue of the way they lived their life, they were getting all of those things all the time. They were outside. They were eating seasonally, locally, and fresh. To get their food, they had to move their body. So they were exercising by virtue of hunting and gathering their food. They lived in tribes. They slept underneath the stars. They were out in the sun. Just by living in their very existence, they got everything that they needed. But we're living now in a society where we're so disconnected from nature that we're so fragmented, we're not getting all those things that we need. And we go, oh, it's so difficult to actually do that because it means I need to change the way I'm existing. How am I going to find an hour a day to get outside in the sun? How am I going to get time away from work to go and exercise at the gym? Oh, it's a big pain. Oh, now I got to go and find healthy food and cook it myself. No, I'm just going to buy the packet food. There's so many different things that need to change in people's lives that it seems insurmountable for them to achieve it. So once you understand that actually those things are what we need, and they are very simple, and every young child knows this in their heart, what a human being needs and what a plant needs and what an animal needs, and that it's not a mystery. It takes a lot of the uncertainty and the fear, etc., away from basically minimizing disease and then being able to reverse it.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to tell you about Wild Pasture's amazing meat delivery service. They have beef, chicken, pork, and wild-caught fish. My family and I have been enjoying their meat for quite some time now, and I just couldn't wait to tell you about it any longer. We had an amazing barbecue this weekend, and I'm still high off the meat. And they use a whole network of regenerative farms, which means that you're getting a different ecosystem from each farm, which means a different nutritional profile, which means nutritional diversity, which means health and vitality, which is exactly what we need right now in the world for ourselves and our families so we can all make a difference in the world. And Matt Smith's going to tell us more about this amazing company, Wild Pastures, about their offering and how you can get it. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I'm excited to tell your listeners what they can get today and how we can help them out. So, as you know, pastured meats are crazy expensive. And so our goal with Wild Pastures is to tap into this network of regenerative farmers and to finally create the solution of where we can get the highest quality meats delivered straight to your door for the most affordable prices around. And so we're on average seeing that we are 40% cheaper than any other delivery option out there, and that our customers have reportedly saved, on average, $1,000 on their grocery bill from meat alone. And so Wild Pastures is a regenerative meat delivery service that is solving this problem. And you can get 100% grass-fed and finished, as well as pasture-raised pork and poultry and wild-caught seafood from Alaska delivered straight to your door. So it's far more convenient. It's far more environmentally friendly because we're using regenerative farms entirely. We don't use feedlots ever. So the nutrition profiles are way better. You can definitely taste the difference. I know we were talking about this on our just before we hopped on, you having a Father's Day barbecue and how incredible the pasture-raised chicken and beef short ribs were. And you can really taste the difference, right?
I'm still high.
And so our goal is to remove the roadblock from people's minds that if they want to eat healthy, it's too expensive. And so that's where Wild Pastures comes in, is we are delivering with our own fleets of trucks whenever possible. We haven't raised our meat prices in over 3 years at this point. And we're really just creating convenience for the consumer and kind of being the high tide that rises all ships. If we can opt more people into a system like this, the cost stays down for everybody. And so there is a myriad of benefits that go into that. And so today, if your listeners want to try Wild Pastures and taste the difference and experience what it's like, go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek or click the link in the show notes and save 20% off for life, plus get free shipping for life, plus get $15 off your first box.
That's a mind-blowing deal. I can't even imagine. I mean, I've never heard of an offer like that. And, most people would hear an offer like that and think, this can't be that good. But I'm telling you, it's not only that good, it's really good. Or I would not be sharing this on my podcast. I think everybody needs to get a hold of Wild Pastures for their family, for their vitality, for their longevity, and for the future of this planet. So thank you guys very much. So Matt, just repeat the website again.
Sure. Just go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek or visit the link in the show notes and get 20% off for life, plus free shipping for life, plus $15 off your first box so you can try it.
You'll be glad you did.
The final point I'll sort of make is also to understand what disease actually is, because we're under this impression that disease is just this random thing that comes out of nowhere
and attacks you.
The body's imperfect. It's this sort of self-destructive process. It's out there to get me. It's something that comes from the outside and it infects me, and it's there to destroy my body. My body's done something wrong. But actually, that's not what disease is. The body always wants to stay in a state of harmony or balance, as does nature. And, why are those two things similar? Because they are one and the other, as you mentioned or alluded to before. We are not separate to nature. We are a part of it. So a good analogy, a good way to think about this is if you think about some water when it is in a state of balance, it would be level, it's flat, like it's so still you could see your reflection in it. It's in a state of balance. Now, if you come along and drop a rock into that water, you're going to get ripples emanating from that central point in all directions outwards. Now, those ripples are the effect. They're the symptoms of dropping the rock in. So the water, you could say, is in a state of dis-ease. It's in a state of imbalance. You don't look at those symptoms or the ripples and go, oh, the water's got a disease. There's something wrong with the water. And now we've got to do things to try and stop the ripples. So no, if you allow the water to do what it needs to do, all of those ripples or the symptoms are the water now in an active state of returning to balance. So that is what disease is. It is the body in an active state of returning to balance. When you have signs or symptoms, the damage has already been done. The cause of the problem has already come and gone in most cases, but it could still be there if you're over-consuming alcohol or not exercising or you're getting exposed to poison or whatever. That's sort of chronic dis-ease.
You keep dropping rocks.
if you keep dropping rocks, we could say that that's like chronic disease. But what it is it's actually the body in a chronic state of trying to return to balance because you're insulting it all the time. So what you need to do is stop dropping rocks into the water. And then the symptoms, the effect, are the answer to the problem. You let the water rebalance itself and it will get there in time. So it's the same thing with the human body. The symptoms that we experience are not the disease. The symptoms that we experience are the answer to the problem. Therefore, you don't want to suppress the symptoms because you're actually stopping the healing process. So that then raises the question, what are the rocks that we're dropping into the water? What are the causes of disease? Medicine has done a really clever job by confusing cause and effect. So they tell people the effect is the cause, and by sort of having that erroneous belief, we can never get to the bottom of disease because, it's the inflammation that's the cause, or it's the germ that's the cause, or it's the cholesterol that's the cause, or it's this or that. It's your blood pressure, it's the blood sugar, it's all these things. They're all the effects. The rocks are toxins, poisons, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, a lack of sunlight, a lack of meaning and purpose in life,
lack of
sleep,
yep.
lack of good quality food. So simple. So you give the body what it needs and you stop insulting it with poison, and then it will self-correct itself. And basically any so-called disease that you see is a conservative self-correcting process. When you stop doing those things to the body, you stop insulting it and give it what it needs, then it allows the body's innate self-healing capacity to basically run its course, and the body will correct itself and return to a state of balance. But that sounds really simple when I explain it like that, but that knowledge has been lost because what we currently believe is that it's something in nature out to get me, that it's a germ or a bug or something floating in the air, that I have no control over when I'm exposed to that thing. It's just going to happen randomly to me, and therefore I'm a victim. I'm at the mercy of Mother Nature. I'm at the mercy of a gene or a germ or my body doing something wrong or my genes. And it's all a futile exercise. So what I do doesn't really matter. And when you think like that, you don't then therefore do the things that you need to do to maintain and regain health. So yeah, it's really very simple in principle. And that is what a doctor should do. That should be like the first time a person comes into your clinic, you sit down and you have that conversation with someone and they go, now I understand why I need to eat well. Now I understand why it's important to exercise. Rather than them going, well, yeah, I mean, these things we're told are important, but there's still all these other things that are out to get me. So it doesn't really matter if I don't eat well because that's not the key determining factor of my health. So these things are not new knowledge. This has been with us for a very long time, and it's time for us to reconnect with that knowledge and simplify health.
In my institute training for holistic lifestyle coaches, I have an operating motto or credo. We do not treat the disease that has the patient. We coach the client or the patient that has acquired the disease. In other words, we don't go chasing diseases. And an example I give is, when I was a soldier in basic training, is a very good scientific study environment because everybody's doing the same activities, the same times a day, consistently for 8 weeks. And the example I give my students is you can see under the duress of basic training, which is psychologically stressful and for a lot of people physically stressful. For me, I was getting fat because it was just too low a level of conditioning. But for most people, it was very physically stressful. But you'd have some people that would get fevers and get this or that. Some people would get flus or colds. And there was 4 cases in my basic training round of soldiers that I was with that tried to commit suicide because the stress was so high they couldn't deal with it. There you have a great scientific study. But if we were all the same and reacted to the stresses the same, then we would all have the exact same response. But what you see is due to different psychological factors, different genetic factors, different predetermined health factors coming into the military, everybody responds differently. But the reality of it is what was the same was the stressors. We were all doing the same exercise. We were all eating the same lousy food, unfortunately. We were all lacking the same amount of sleep. So you can see if you treat the disease, but you don't look at the environmental stressors, then you're marching in the wrong direction. And I created a concept many years ago to help my students understand something very important to our conversation. I call it the echo effect, the echo effect. And it's an acronym. E stands for energy, C stands for chemistry, H stands for hydration, and O stands for the organisms that you consume. And what I show is that whatever we do through the intentions of man, such as industry, poisoning the environment or drilling for oil and fracking and chemtrails and whatever you do to the energy in nature, it is what you eat and what you breathe and what you drink. You're doing it to yourself. Whatever you do to the chemistry of the environment, you do it to yourself. Whatever you do to the water that you drink, hydration, outside, to the creatures, to the oil, to the oceans, to the rivers, to the streams, you're doing it to yourself. And whatever you do to the organisms, you farm chickens and pigs and cows in commercial feedlots where they live in their own feces and urine for their life and are drugged to the hilt and fed sawdust chips, plastic chips, engine oil, and a long list of other stuff that would shock the hell out of people if they knew that was actually put in their food. And they take grains that have been rejected due to high levels of mycotoxins and they can't be fed to human beings, and they feed them to the animals because it makes them sick and makes them fat. And then they sell them for more money because they don't do body fat calibrations on animals. They sell them by the pound. So the sicker they make them, the body stores all the toxins in the fat to protect the internal organs. So they make these animals fat very quick and they sell them to you, and you're eating poison food. So there's a pendulum swing. Whatever we do through our own greed, stupidity, or ignorance causes an effect on the environment. We're in the environment, so the pendulum swings back to us. I teach my students you have to look carefully at energy factors, such as you cultivate energy through food, you cultivate energy through hydration, you cultivate energy through sleep, you cultivate energy through movement, you cultivate energy through effective breathing. You can cultivate energy through the skillful application of what I call work-in exercises, such as Tai Chi, Qigong, and gentle exercises that cost your body less energy and resources to do than it produces. So you end up with a surplus, which is why people have been doing Tai Chi and Qigong for thousands of years, because it makes you more vital, more durable, and more clear-headed, more sane. No bear poisons its own environment. No beaver lights forest fires. It's when we get a neocortex that we get ourselves in a lot of trouble because we override our instincts. So we really need to be very conscious of these very, very basic principles and apply them and be conscious of our responsibility, because we are the ones that are actually doing the most damage to the environment. It's not like the nature is out to get us. We are nature, as you've alluded to in the past. One of the things you said earlier, I wanted to highlight a little bit about. There really is the illusion. There's the concept of inside and outside is an illusion. The average human being breathes 25,900 breaths a day. It came from outside of you. You've got to drink approximately half your body weight in ounces of water a day to be healthy and well hydrated. All that came from outside of you. All the food you ate came from outside of you. I tell people all the time, you're sitting and watching television commercials regularly of people spraying the food you eat that are wearing hazmat suits. Yet you don't even question that you're putting that food in your mouth. I mean, if you've got that lack of common sense and you're willing to eat food that the very people putting it on have to wear protective gear that's suitable to biochemical warfare in the military, and you eat it, and the reality of it is 96% of the food eaten in the world is commercially farmed. Only 4% of the food grown and eaten in the world is organically farmed, which is absolutely a devastating fact. But the point I'm driving at is people need to remember that we are actually a highly permeable membrane, and that whatever we're doing outside, even things like I'm wearing blue blocker glasses because the light coming off this screen has a damaging effect on your eyes, on your brain. We could go through all that. That's a long story. As I said, whatever's 60% of what's on your skin enters your bloodstream in your body. If you lay in a bathtub full of chlorine, 60% of it will go right through your skin into your body. When you put chemicals on your body through suntan lotions that are not organic, you're poisoning your body. When you're putting underarm sprays and deodorants and perfumes and makeups on that are all full of chemicals, you're going right into your body. I think one of the things that people need to realize in order to make this movement towards cleaning up the environment is because people have this illusory idea that somehow their inner environment is segregated from the external environment. And as long as I don't feel too bad, who gives a shit if they're poisoning the planet? Because it's not affecting me. But, I tell people when they come with cancer, I say, you know what? It takes about 10 years for most people to develop cancer or more. We don't want to look for the bad guy that just showed up yesterday. We need to look at the habits and the traumas and the emotions and the challenging relationships and the diet and lifestyle factors that have been going on a long time, because the body has no interest in being sick. It's trying constantly, as you've mentioned several times now, to be healthy. So what I'm driving at here is that someone goes to the doctor and they get this terrible diagnosis, and you might only have 6 months to live if you don't have a miracle happen, but they don't realize that process took at least 10 years to reach a head like that. But now they want to make it go away overnight. So next thing you know, they're opting for chemo and radiation and radical surgery. And so, that starts a whole cascade again of 50% of people in the critical ward. Based on research, 50% of people that end up in the critical ward in the hospital spend their entire life savings in the last 5 days of their life doing medical testing, trying to find a last-ditch magical cure to keep them alive. So people are highly, highly profitable when they're really sick, because they will throw their entire bank account at anything the doctor can sell them that they think might work. But it's far, far better to just do these things on a daily basis. I break it down simply. I mean, forgive my audience if you've heard me say this 1,000 times, but I say there's 4 doctors: Dr. Happiness, Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, and Dr. Movement. They're the only 4 doctors you'll ever need if you really listen to them. And there's 6 foundation principles: nutrition, hydration, sleep, breathing, thinking, and movement. You cannot escape the reality of those. You've got to have a adequate level of participation and awareness of those 6 foundation principles, or you're going to be a medical statistic, and you're probably going to end up having financial troubles, as I mentioned earlier. One of the things that I wanted to do, if you could give a little breakdown of the layout of your book, because it's not a huge book. What is it? A couple 250 pages or something?
I think if you exclude the references, nearly 400, I think.
Yeah, so close to 400 pages. So maybe you could just share a kind of a breakdown of the structure of the book, so that if people don't have time to read almost 400 pages, they could know where to go to get key information. And then before we finish, I'd love to get to the issues of having whether or not a virus has been isolated, and what do virologists mean when they say the isolated virus, because I think that's something that can't be shared enough.
Yeah, sure. Totally resonate with everything you've said there, Paul.
Thank you.
I mean, we can really just sum that all up. And it sounds like everything that you're teaching is very similar to sort of my perspectives and what I teach, as is similar to the conclusions that many other people who have looked at this have come to. And, it says a lot that we all sort of end up at the same endpoint when we look at this critically through the correct lens. And I guess the truth is that you can only be as healthy as the environment that you exist in. You can only be as healthy as the soil that you're eating from. So once we understand that, you must then, by virtue of that, have to take care of your surroundings. Because if you're poisoning it and destroying it, well, then you're going to end up the same way. Yeah, so in relation to the book, it's divided into 3 different sections. Yeah, Can You Catch a Cold? Untold History and Human Experiments. So it sort of gives you a bit of an idea of what we'll talk about. The first section is the untold history. So it actually explores what the world was like before germ theory and how it came to be, and the sort of scientific debate that was going on between people like Pasteur and his contemporaries, and people like Béchamp and his contemporaries, when one crowd was saying the germ is the thing that's responsible, and the other crowd was saying, no, it's the environment. The environment is the thing that is the key denominating factor. Many people believe that germ theory was proven and that it was just widely accepted by medicine, and that's the end of the story. When in fact, this idea of contagion was about to be thrown out. It was on the verge of being discarded entirely by the medical profession in 1950 something. And then Pasteur came along and threw them a lifeline, and the medical system was basically forced to accept this idea, or if you didn't want to accept it, you get thrown out. So there was pushback for 30 years longer where doctors and teaching institutions were pushing back against this idea that it was a germ. They were basically saying, no, it's all the things we just spoke about. They were called sanitarian doctors.
And does this have to do with Rockefeller's initiatives and the Flexner
Well,
report?
yeah, I don't go into that in great detail. I sort of more focus on the germ theory, contagion theory sort of information. I don't go deep into the Rockefeller, Carnegie, Flexner reports side of things, even though I have in other presentations that I've done. So we go through and talk about all that stuff in the first section of the book to really set the scene and go through and talk about what doctors thought the cause of colds and flus was before viruses. So they assumed that it was a bacteria. For nearly 4 decades, they thought that it was caused by Pfeiffer's bacillus. They believed that it was a bacterial cause, and they treated common colds and flus accordingly, even though they were completely wrong. It wasn't a bacteria. When they proved that it wasn't a bacteria, they thought, well, it must be something smaller. So if it's not a bacteria, there's got to be something smaller in your body that's causing the problem. And they came up with this idea that it's a virus, and no one could ever find one. But this idea was sort of perpetuated, and we accept it today. The second section of the book gets into looking at human experiments. So we look at over 200 different experiments and attempts where doctors and scientists tried to make healthy people sick by putting them either in direct contact with sick people or exposing them to their bodily fluids or exposing them to cell cultures. And we can talk about cell cultures after this. And basically that evidence demonstrates that contagion hasn't been demonstrated or proven. They really struggled to make anybody sick. And if they did become ill in those experiments, there were other explanations as to why a person fell ill. So, for example, they might have sprayed something up someone's nose, like some mucus from a sick person, and said, oh, look, they got sick, must have been a virus. But they have shown that there are like inflammatory mediators like bradykinin that increase in concentration in people's mucus when they're ill. And when you're exposed to pure bradykinin, it induces symptoms of a cold or flu.
Oh, interesting.
So were
I
they
didn't know
getting
that.
sick from the... Yeah, there's all these sort of things that are in mucus that when isolated and exposed to a human cause symptoms. So there might be a dozen of these things hanging around in mucus, but when you spray it up into someone's nose and they get ill, we say it's a virus, and we discard all these other possibilities. So if we were being scientifically honest with ourselves, what we would have to do is say, right, we think it's a virus, but we have to show that it's not any of these other things in the mucus causing the effect. And when we demonstrate that, and the only thing that's possible to be causing it that is left is a virus, well, now we can start to investigate this. But they never did that. They just went, oh, it's the virus, figured all the other stuff. And there's the placebo effect and the nocebo effect and expectation and these kinds of things. I think in that section, we get into talking about, in the first section, we also talk about previous pandemics as well. So what happened in the Spanish flu, for example? How come all these people were getting ill? What was going on? And we basically put forward this idea that it was due to gas poisoning in World War I. So the symptoms of gas poisoning were essentially identical to what Spanish flu was. We're talking about coughing up blood, your skin turning a deep purple or black color. They called the Spanish flu the Black Death.
Yes, Black Plague.
The Black Plague. People who died would smell of hay or musty straw. A very peculiar symptom to have when you're dying of the flu. Yeah. Just so it turns out that people poisoned by phosgene gas also smelled like musty hay or straw. So we actually have a table in the book that compares all the symptoms between phosgene gas poisoning and the Spanish flu. They're identical. There are autopsy reports by doctors and even the military where they're saying we cannot tell the difference between people who were poisoned with poison gas and people who died of the flu. People say, well, how come there were people dying in cities of the Spanish flu? How is that happening? Again, there's reports, mainstream reports of spies infiltrating city centres and releasing canisters of flu germs in shopping centres and cinemas and all these places. So were they really releasing flu germ canisters, or were they releasing phosgene gas and poisoning people in the street? Like, people would leave their home in the morning perfectly fine. They'd walk to work, and on their walk to work, they'd die.
Wow.
They would turn black and they'd cough up blood and they'd be dead within minutes. What
That's
sort of
not
a flu does that?
It's not a flu.
What was really going on there? So we sort of put a case forward for that with various other potential causes as well, like the Russian influenza epidemic, which happened in the sort of late 1800s, put forward different perspectives. The second part's human experiments. And then the third part is alternative explanations about what causes colds and flus. So we get into the nocebo effect, we get into social contagion, we talk about mass psychogenic illness. So there's this idea that when you see groups of people falling sick with the same symptoms at the same time, one after another, the only way that that can be explained is by a contagious infectious particle spreading between people. There's over 80 documented instances of mass psychogenic illness outbreaks in the literature where people fell sick, the same symptoms, same time, one after another, but there was no germ involved. So one of these examples is the Tanganyika laughing epidemic, which happened in Tanzania in the 60s or 70s, where there was a school, a boarding school, and the girls there, it was a girls' school, started experiencing uncontrollable bouts of laughter, which was incredibly debilitating for them, and they felt like they were being chased by something. So they were incapacitated with this, and it spread throughout the whole school. They had to close the school down, and then they sent all the girls back to their respective villages, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers away, all across Africa. And when those girls went back to their villages, the townsfolk started experiencing these uncontrollable bouts of laughter and feeling like someone was chasing them, and they were all incapacitated. Now, this went on for years. It spread all across Africa. I think it affected thousands of people. They could never work out what the cause was. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no virus that spreads between people that causes these peculiar symptoms. And this is what they call mass psychogenic illness. As I said, there's 80 recorded instances of this. I think we cover about a dozen in the book. That was just too many to put in the book. And we also talk about other potential causes like air pollution, for example. So around the same time as the outbreak happened in Wuhan in China, there was a meteorological effect or a phenomena that occurred. So it was a change in the humidity and temperature. Now, when that temperature change occurred, a thing called a temperature inversion happened. So usually what happens is in areas where there's lots of pollution, it's close to the layer of the earth or the surface of the ground during the day. And at night, as the air cools, that hot air rises and takes away the pollution with it, and then you get the cool layer of air closer towards the ground. So you basically have the pollution being taken away from the low-lying areas close to where the cities are every day. When there's a temperature inversion, a change in humidity and temperature, you get a cap of cold air that gets trapped over the top of that warmer layer of air underneath it, and it traps that pollution close to the ground. Now, there was a temperature inversion that happened all across China in late 2019, early 2020. Why is that important? Because the air pollution in China isn't so good at the best of times. So the WHO, you can think about them what you want. Their current recommendation for air quality is no more than 5 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate matter. They call it PM2.5, which is one of the most damaging air pollutants known to man. So no more than 5 micrograms of PM2.5 in a cubic meter of air. When these temperature inversions happened in China, levels went up to like 700 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, they're saying that that's the equivalent of smoking several packs of cigarettes every day.
Wow.
So if you go from smoking no cigarettes a day to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to start getting
sick.
Respiratory symptoms, you're going to start getting sick, and you would see large groups of people now being exposed to this high level of air pollution, and it looks like, oh my God, there's something spreading between people because, tens or thousands or millions of people are being affected, and we blame it on a virus. Now, mainstream science says, well, what actually happens is you do get more pollution in the air, but it's not the pollution making people sick. The virus can adhere more readily to the air pollution particles in the atmosphere. And when you breathe in the particulates, it's the virus piggybacking on the pollution that makes you sick.
It's called piggybacking bullshit on stupidity. Yeah.
So there's all these sort of alternative explanations. We talk about the role of temperature and humidity and these kinds of things and how they induce physiological change in the body, which causes symptoms that are identical to colds and flus. So this is why our forefathers called them colds and flus. They called the cold after a change in temperature. It's the
Right.
symptoms that people experience when they get exposed to cold weather. Influenza means the influence of the cold. So
Ah.
I don't think our forefathers were stupid. And this is even written in medical dictionaries in the 1900s. They said the cause of colds and flus are exposure to meteorological effects, changes in temperature and humidity.
Have you read the book or listened to it, The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg?
Yeah, it's somewhere here. Yes.
Okay,
Got it right
good.
there.
So you're familiar with the fact that influenza broke out almost every time they put up a new radio tower or radar unit or television station all over the world. This happened. So what's your thoughts on that?
I didn't go into it in the book in any great detail because I found it very difficult to find controlled studies on that.
Yeah, well, they don't
So
want those
really, I
studies
wanted
being
to
done.
approach this. Well, exactly right. So I tried to present information that I could, like I could point to a paper. I'm like, here's a paper, here's a controlled experiment that was done. So I'm not saying that exposure to electromagnetic frequencies and these things isn't harmful or damaging. It was just very difficult to find solid evidence for that. And that's maybe because science hasn't been done. Like one thing we do know is that when we breathe in particulate matter in the air, our lungs basically clear it out. So we've got these little finger-like projections in our respiratory tract called cilia.
Microvilli.
Yeah,
Villi.
yeah, they're like little brooms essentially, the cilia, and they brush all that stuff that you inhale from the air out of your lungs into your back of your throat. You cough it out or you sneeze it out. Now, when there's a change in humidity and it drops below a certain threshold, that process is inhibited. It dries out your mucous membranes, so the little cilia can't perform their mucociliary clearance. So you start to get a buildup of particulate matter in your respiratory tract. Now, when that happens, the body sloughs off the lining of your respiratory tract to basically get rid of this stuff that's accumulating in there, and you produce more mucus and you start to cough it out and sneeze it out, and you get it being broken down by the little macrophages in your lungs. And we call that a cold or a flu.
Ah,
But it's
yeah.
actually
A
induced
healing
by a
process.
change in humidity. It's the body doing what it needs to do in response to
The
a
environment.
change of temperature or humidity from like a change in season, for example. So this is why we see a seasonal effect with influenza. Now, it just so happens that temperature inversions happen when there's a change in these meteorological effects. So not only do we have our body's natural elimination process impaired, we also then have a higher amount of pollution we're breathing in, and we get these symptoms. You go, oh, gee, there's something spreading. But it could very easily be explained by other phenomena. So that's sort of the book in a nutshell.
Well, that's fantastic. Look, we've had a great run. We've covered a lot. I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about, but I really enjoyed it. I'm really grateful you have put the book out. And now that I've had a chance to talk to you, I can realize there's more in the book than I picked up just by my, spending a half an hour, 45 minutes looking through it to kind of pick up the vibe. I mean, I knew it was good because Lee Brandon would never tell me to interview you if it wasn't good. But I'm grateful that it's out there. I think, what you've covered today is enough for a lot of people to want to really look into this. It's kind of like when RFK published The Real Anthony Fauci. I don't know how many. I think that book sold maybe 1 million copies or something like that now or more. But it really woke people up to to the fact that we have a medical mafia is what we've got. It helps bring some common sense back and a little bit more clarity of vision. And I think learning these things helps us all be more aware. And like we've both been discussing, at the end of the day, it boils down to some common sense practices, what I classify as the 4 doctors and the 6 foundation principles. Isn't it interesting how almost all of those things we were being told not to by the chief heads of medicine all over the world during COVID? Don't be with people that you love. Don't be out in the sunshine. Don't eat natural products. Tons of stuff that used to be available, from zinc to vitamin C, all of a sudden miraculously disappeared off of shelves. And so, that kind of points back to something a lot deeper going on than a virus. So again, but these are the things that we've all got to be aware of, because the governments are always supposed to be in service to the people. Lao Tzu said the government always reflects the people. And that was, Lao Tzu said that a long, long time ago. So it means that we've really got to not only blame the governments and the organizations, but we've got to look at ourselves and say, what's our part in allowing this to happen and continuing to fund it? And what are we so distracted from that we don't have time to look at the most important things that determine the health of our environment and the health of our children and therefore our own future? And I think, we have to be I did a video, a podcast actually called The Danger of Living in Two Realities, all about the danger of getting trapped in the digital reality. And I think we're at a point now where we've got to become a lot more savvy about how much time we spend engaging digital media. And now that AI is so effective, you don't know what you're seeing anymore. You don't know if it's true. You don't know if it's made up. It's so easy to trick people now that in a nutshell, I think that this podcast that we've just done together has brought people a lot of opportunities to become a lot more aware about a lot of things, ask a lot better questions. And I hope people feel very inspired to read your book. I'm very grateful that you've taken the time and the effort to put the book together. And I'm also grateful that you've taken the time out of your lecturing, and it's not an easy thing to leave the comfort of a supportive job and career like that to go off on your own and put yourself at risk of being attacked. So I say, yay, Daniel, you got some balls, baby. You're in the health club. So congratulations, and thank you for your service to all of us. Where can people find out more about anything you want to offer? Websites, best places to buy books? I imagine it's on Amazon. I think I bought it on Amazon, actually.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you. The best place for people to find my work is on my website, www.humanly.com. And if you'd like to acquire a copy of my book, I encourage all health professionals or just anyone who is health minded to read this book, because it doesn't tell you what to think. It's getting you to think. So we just provide the evidence, and then you can make up your mind and come to whatever conclusion that you want to based on the evidence that we provide you. And that book, the best place to get it is on Amazon.com. Just type in "Can You Catch a Cold" into the search and the book will come up. We also had a lot of input, not just from myself with this book. It took 4 years to write. There's over 1,000 references in this book. We had the foreword written by Dr. Samantha Bailey, who is an absolute powerhouse, and her husband, Dr. Mark Bailey, edited this book. I had a team of medical doctors. I had a virologist, a microbiologist, and a PhD psychologist assist with the writing and editing of this book as well, because we wanted to make sure that all of our I's were dotted, all of our T's were crossed, and the information that was presented here was as accurate and informative as possible for people to get a really intricate understanding of a condition that has been with us since the dawn of time, and to understand that it may not be our enemy, but one of our greatest allies. So thank you so much, Paul, for having me on the show. It means a lot, and it was an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Yes, my pleasure too, Daniel. Thank you. I look forward to a podcast in the future. If you have a new book coming out or something new that you think is important to share, feel free to send me an email. And as we close, I'd like to say thank you to all of you guys listening. As Daniel and I discussed, it's up to us. And, it doesn't take 51%. It takes just a couple of million of us in a state of coherence and a higher level of consciousness and a commitment to be the change. And, there's no better evidence than you walking around in your swimsuit, your gym clothes. And everywhere I've gone in my life, I've found that when people see that I eat differently, that I train differently, that I'm in good shape, they've always come to me and asked questions. Flight attendants, even doctors, everybody's watching. So be the silent lover and be the silent teacher. All you got to do is make that change in your own life, and everybody around you picks up on the difference. And so, we can do this together. Thank you to my sponsors for all your love and support, your excellent products. And thank you for all of you for buying anything from the sponsors, because that money goes into the hands of biodynamic and organic farmers. And whatever you buy from my sponsors is actually providing support for real research by real scientists to make better products and to feed the soil and to support all of us. And a little bit goes to the podcast to support me so I can keep doing the podcast. So thank you for supporting the sponsors. And I look forward to sharing something exciting with you next week. And I look forward to having Daniel back again, because obviously he's a very legitimate researcher, clinician, has a lot of experience, does a good job. And like me, he's invested in the truth, which is a great gift to find people like that. And again, thanks to Lee Brandon for turning me on to Daniel. And Lee Brandon has an excellent podcast as well. So if you just go on your podcast feed and search Lee Brandon, you'll find another great podcast by a highly skilled Chek professional. So lots of love to all of you guys. Look forward to talking to you real soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Daniel Roytas. Daniel's website is humanly.com, which is spelled HUMANLEY.com. There you can find his podcast, the Humanly Free Webinar Library, and all of Daniel's upcoming projects. You can also follow Daniel on Telegram at t.me/humanly. His book, You Can't Catch a Cold, Untold History and Human Experiments, can be purchased from Amazon, or check the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast for a direct link. On the show notes page, you can also find details of the special offers from our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, Wild Pastures, and Organifi, as well as links to Paul's social media, his YouTube channels, and his blog. If you'd like to dive deeper into Spirit Gym with Paul Chek, we invite you to join the podcast membership. When you subscribe, you'll get access to exclusive extended episodes, members-only opportunities with Paul and podcast guests, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community, where you can interact with other passionate listeners, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. Your support helps keep the show running and allows us to bring you even more and even better content. So if you're ready to dive deeper and unlock all these amazing extras, head over to paulchek.com/podcast and become a Spirit Gym podcast member today. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.